Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with our good friend, Kathy Izard. Kathy has released an excellent book titled Trust the Whisper, How Answering Quiet Callings Inspires Extraordinary Stories of Ordinary Grace. Kathy's an award-winning author and speaker who has helped bring transformation to Charlotte, North Carolina in homelessness, housing, and mental health. Kathy writes inspirational nonfiction for adults, including The 100-Story Home and The Last Ordinary Hour, both of which I highly recommend. And she also has written two books for children, A Good Night for Mr. Coleman and Grace Heard a Whisper, that is somewhat correlated to the book that we're going to talk about. Um, she also works through her program called Women, Faith, and Story, where Kathy helps women find faith in their story with one-on-one mentoring, workshops, and retreats. She's a recipient of a Christopher Award, the Bank of America Neighborhood Hero Award, 2022 Charlotte Woman of the Year, and was recognized as a William J. Clinton Distinguished Guest Lecturer. I should also mention Kathy has attended and spoken at some of the Writing for Your Life conferences that I produced, and I've interviewed her several times for her previous books. So you can learn more about Kathy at kathyizard.com, KATHYIZARD.com. So Kathy, it's so great to be here with you again, and
Oh, great to
congratulations
see you.
on
Yeah,
yet
good to be
another
with
great
you,
book.
Brian. Thank
Oh,
you. Thanks
well,
so much.
so what else would you like people to know about you than what I was touching on there?
Well, that was a lot. You kind of hit all the highlights. Maybe I'm as well as a writer. I'm a mom. I'm a grandmom. We have four daughters and two grandsons, and we split our time between Charlotte, North Carolina, and Jackson Hole, which is where I'm talking to you right now. So, great place to write in the summers. That's where I've gotten a lot of writing done. Is looking at these mountains and walking the trails. So.
That has to be inspiring. I love that part of the country.
Yeah, when you're looking at the mountains, yeah, it's very inspirational. So
I'll never forget the first time I got off a plane in Cody, Wyoming. The air just felt completely different. It was so fresh.
it's so true. Whenever we get off the plane here, I feel like that you get a giant exhale of like, I don't know what's happening in the world. You can kind of disconnect and you look at the mountains and you go into the forest and your biggest worry of the day is, will I run into a moose or a bear? So
Really. So for people who have not read your previous books, in order to give us some context, could you talk about your faith journey?
sure. I will have to say, I think a lot of it started in 2007. I was a graphic designer. I had nothing to do with writing or any aspirations of writing, and was raising our four kids. But I thought that the life I was living was not what I was supposed to be doing. And I did volunteer in the soup kitchen. We took our kids to the soup kitchen, and something about that made me feel like, yes, like this direction. But I certainly didn't think that homelessness or anything with homelessness was what I was meant to be doing because it felt like a hugely unsolvable problem. And I think that's where the faith journey came in because I had a classic epiphany that I wrote about in my first book, The 100-Story Home, where I had a moment with someone who was formerly homeless themselves who helped me see homelessness in a way that I had never seen it or never thought about it. And it started what I would call my first whisper in terms that I could not shake the idea that I should close my graphic design business and go work for this soup kitchen to work on housing, which honestly make no sense whatsoever because I was completely unqualified. There's no reason to imagine that I would be able to do anything. But I do think that was the beginning of my faith journey and the beginning of my new life path, kind of discarding all my plans I thought I had for my life and the logical things I thought I should do and really kind of surrender and trust that maybe there was something else. And that turned into creating a housing program. We raised $10 million dollars and we built a building. It gave me a story to tell, which I wrote about in the book. And also just this belief that I can encourage others. Like I think every one of us is called to something. And it's a lot of my work is now is encouraging people, primarily a lot of women, but men and women that there is something calling each of us and that if we're willing to surrender, if we're willing to trust and listen, that I do think our life path kind of opens up in remarkable ways.
It's your story and what you've done and been through is just really compelling and outstanding. And we'll talk more about, some of the God moments here in a bit. but your publishing journey is also quite fascinating. So can you tell people
Yes.
that
Well, I am like probably what so many people who might be watching this, because I stumbled across Writing for Your Life in Indianapolis. I wanted to go hear Barbara Brown Taylor, and I literally didn't even know what I stumbled into. I just wanted to hear her, which I think she's amazing, and ended up meeting you and finding this whole writers community. But as I said, I wanted to tell this one story of how I quit my job and went into something very different. Again, I was not a writer. I just started taking a lot of writing classes, going to writing conferences. Like many people watching, I couldn't get an agent or anyone who cared about my manuscript, even though I spent 6 years writing it. Um, and so because I'd spent 6 years and because I'm stubborn, I just thought, well, I want to hold at least one copy of a book. So I figured out the self-publishing. I now coach and help other people. So if anyone's watching and wants help on that, I coach and help people independently publish or make that decision. But I put that one copy in the world and started talking and going to book clubs and faith groups and, churches talking about it. And it did end up not only selling a lot of copies, self-published, but it did, as you mentioned, get that Christopher Award. And that helped me get an agent and a publisher. So I got a book contract on a self-published book, which rarely happens.
Yes.
And that went into the world. And then I wanted to do a children's version of that so that to help kids understand homelessness. So I self-published a kid's book called A Good Night for Mr. Coleman. So I go back and forth between this new book that we're going to talk about. I did get an agent and a book contract, and that is that is traditionally published. But I've independently published another book, The Last Ordinary Hour, and my kids' book are independently published. So I do try to pick and choose. If nobody wants the book and I'm feeling stubborn about it, I'll put it out there anyway. So I do. If you get nothing else from this, I would just say, if you're writing a book and you love it, don't worry. Don't get permission from a traditional publisher to do it. Put your story in the world and see what happens. So.
Well, if you haven't gathered already, Kathy is quite entrepreneurial, which is, like one of the reasons why I wanted to, interview her again, in particular for this book. Um, as you mentioned, we met at the Writing for Your Life conference because you came, to see Barbara Brown Taylor, and that was kind of a start of a collaboration between us. And as I look back at, you call them God dots, I can
Yeah.
think of God moments or whatever, but for me that was kind of a God moment, was the fact that you kind of randomly got there, we talked, and as I said, we collaborated on multiple fronts since then. So how do you kind of identify God dots as you do? You talk about some of them in your book.
I do. Trust the Whisperer is a series. It's 20 stories of God dots, of people not only that I met along my book journey, but also in the nonprofit world, people who were listening to their own whisper and how we all became connected. So I think of God dots as, I think we dismiss sometimes when the holy shows up in our life. We think, oh, well, that was a coincidence, or that was really amazing. But we rarely ascribe it to God or to faith or maybe to a larger story. But I think what I realized, and you can see in the writing of that book, when we are willing to say, I wonder if it wasn't coincidence. I wonder if it was meant to be. I wonder if Brian and I were meant to meet at that conference so then we can write and teach together. And I've, been able to go. That's what I think God dots are, is when our stories connect in really remarkable ways that we couldn't have planned, and how our stories interweave with each other. And that is what Trust the Whisper is about, the interweaving of some pretty incredible stories that were people who were strangers and then somehow become integral to each other's story. And I think when we are looking for purpose in life, when we are looking for calling and we're willing to recognize these and to say, gosh, I need this thing. I need to meet this person. And if you kind of say it out loud, it's amazing how many times that person shows up in your life. And I mean, when I showed up at the Writing for Your Life, I was looking for a community. I was feeling like this one person who was trying to write books and who does this. And all of a sudden I show up at Writing for Your Life and it's like, oh my gosh, here's a whole, room full of people who are trying to do the same thing, to write in a faith perspective, not just romance novels, but they were trying to write in this way. And it was very, I don't know, very profound for me to not only see Barbara Brown Taylor at that conference, but to meet you, to see the community that you've built and all these people who are trying to write for good and for faith and to encourage spirituality in our world. So I think we were a God dot.
Yeah, yeah. So, this is the book again, Trust the Whisper. And, Kathy tells the stories of several other people that have experienced, some type of God dot, in their life. What led you to write this particular book?
Yeah. So I think that book I ended up starting to speak, which I was not planning to do anything for the homeless. I was not planning to write a book. I was certainly not planning to speak. If anyone's watching this going, oh, I would never speak. I hate speaking. I sweat. Well, me too. If you would have said that, like some of the top two things I hate to do would be raising money and speaking. And guess what I've been doing for the last 15 years? Anyway, God is funny about that. Because I was going to other cities and talking about the 100-story home and how I felt this calling and really to try and encourage other people. One of the first places I went to out of town, there was a church in Birmingham, Alabama, that asked me to come speak. And frankly, I felt like a complete imposter. I thought, do they know I'm a self-published author? Like my book doesn't really count. Like I can't believe they're asking me to come to this church. But when I got to that church, there was a woman there and she said, oh my gosh, I really want to talk to you because when I read the 100-story home and you were talking about feeling kind of crazy and called to something that you couldn't explain, she said, me too. Like I am feeling really that I need to do something about runaway teens. And she told me this whole story about how teens in Alabama come from all over the state to Birmingham. They arrive on the bus and within hours, sex traffickers prey on these kids who show up alone and they're sucked into sex trafficking within hours of what they were. And she said, I think the solution is so simple. And I thought, gosh, I don't know. That sounds super complicated. I don't know what the solution is. And she said, all we have to do is build a teen shelter next to the bus station, and then we'll be the first people they meet and not the sex traffickers. And that was the first time, Brian, that I thought, oh my gosh, that is what this book is about. I need to tell people how unqualified I was so that they will do whatever it is that they are meant to do. And so I started a friendship with this woman, Caroline Bundy. I started to think, oh my gosh, she would be the next book. Like, what if there was a book of people who were listening to their whispers and what happened? And I even started writing her stories down. I'd met some other people. I had probably 5 or 6 threads going of people who were listening. And I realized, okay, it's only a good book if they listen, right? If they all decide, well, that's hard and I can't do it, and they give up and go home. Okay, well, there goes my book. So I started writing this book like 7 years ago. And
Wow.
then I had to
Wow.
put it down because I had to wait and see, would Caroline Bundy build the teen shelter in Birmingham, Alabama? Well, spoiler alert on chapter 6. Yes, she did. As well as Molly Painter in Raleigh, North Carolina, who ended up doing some incredible things. So people all over, a lot of Southeastern stories, because that's where I write and speak, of people who listened and what happened and then how their stories interconnected. So the book took a while to write because the endings took a while to reveal. But I'm just really proud of the book. I think the stories I got to tell are amazing. And I think that's another piece of it. There's so many people with amazing stories, but they may not be writers or storytellers. And
Yes.
I get to be privileged enough to know their stories, to write their stories and share their stories. So
That is
this
without a
has been,
doubt.
yeah, this has been a fun book because when I go and I'm not just telling my story anymore, I get to tell these stories of amazing people who are doing great things. And I think in this time, it's encouraging because we can hear only some bad news. And I think this book is full of good news stories. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's valuable on multiple levels. That's one of them, right? It's just to see all these instances. And, another thing, as you said, people tend to overlook, you know, what you're calling God dots or what I would call God moments, as
mhm.
coincidence or whatever, as you said. Um, and so for you to really call that out, right, and shine a spotlight on it and kind of investigate it a little bit more because it's one of those things you can't really put your hands around. How does a God moment happen, right? What leads to that?
Yeah, and I don't know, Brian. I mean, I am definitely for anyone listening, I am not a theologian. Like anyone listening, I'm sure more Bible theology than I do and probably could lead to 100 scriptures and 42 books on maybe why this happens. I just have lived experience that I can't ignore and the people that I've met and their lived experience. And I think that is part of the divine. We can't explain it. Even if I did have 100 books, even if I was as smart as Francis Collins, who wrote The Language of God and could, do all of this, maybe I would be able to understand the background and the string theory of it all, but I can't. All I know it's that it's true and that these stories are true. And all I could do was lay them out as, to me, evidence of the holy that's around us every single day. And also noting that if each one of us had not been willing to tell our stories or share our stories, then part of the most fascinating part of the divine would have gone unnoticed. Like the miracles would have gone unnoticed. So I think part of it is we have to believe there's a whisper that we can hear. I think we have to be willing to notice that maybe it's more than coincidence, and we have to be able to be willing to share and talk about it because that's when other connections are revealed and you start to see this bigger, pretty amazing divine weave. So,
Well, the other part of it, that is implicit in all that you've written about in your book is that the people acted on it.
yeah.
They didn't just hear a whisper, right?
Yeah, you
Think about
can't just, yes, that's the trust part. Like, yeah, you can't just listen for the whisper and say, hey, I heard it. That seems really hard, not doing it. You have to
it.
trust it and take the leap of faith. And I do want to say, I think those whispers are a muscle that we can exercise, right? Like it can be as small as you get that thought of like, check on my neighbor. And you think, oh, I haven't thought of my neighbor in a really long time. And then you think, oh, she's older. She lives alone. Maybe I should check on her. Maybe she needs something. And then it turns out she does, right? That's just a tiny whisper where you could think, oh, that was coincidence. I happened to think of her at the right time. And turns out she needed something. But I think the more we exercise that muscle on smaller whispers, that by the time you get to something crazy like I got, like quit your job and go house people experiencing homelessness, that you're more willing to say, all right, I can't see where it's going. I don't have the roadmap, but I think I'll listen and see what happens. I think I'll act on it. So
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, becoming a solopreneur, right? I mean, you're experienced at it now, whether you wanted to or not. You went
yeah,
off,
I know.
quit your job and did some major, incredible things, books, fundraising, et cetera, et cetera. So as you reflect now on, kind of having gone through those different experiences, um, what are some of your big takeaways and some of the big challenges that you faced?
Um, I think my biggest takeaway is the life I am living right now. None of it I would have planned for myself. There's no way I would have dreamed
I know that
this.
feeling.
Yeah, I wouldn't have dreamed this for myself. Like I had this sense that I wanted to do something that would change my one corner of the world. I was just raised with servant leadership as a goal in life. Like you should give back, you should do good. But certainly I was fearful for anything that I might be able to do myself. And I do think starting with leaving my business of graphic design to go do this other has led one step at a time to a life I couldn't have imagined of writing and teaching and coaching and all of that. There's no way 15 years ago, 17 years ago, I would have said, okay, I think I'm going to write 5 books and work on these 2 projects, and then I'm going to teach people. I just couldn't imagine that for myself. And so that's one thing I would say is that um, I think we're all capable of far more than we imagine.
Hmm.
And um, if something matters to you, you can learn it. It mattered to me to figure out housing. Man, I studied and I learned and I gathered people around who were smarter than me and we did it. It mattered to me to figure out how to write this book. I took classes, I showed up at conferences, I met me people smarter than me who knew more than me and I learned from them and I got it done and now I can help other people. So I think if something matters to you and it's tugging at you, then do the work to learn. It's never been easier to learn. YouTube, Google, like you don't have to go to a 4-year grad school or, to get something done. And I think there is in this whisper and this discernment and this calling, there's an element of surrender too, because I think one of the hardest things that I worked on was raising $10 million in 2008
No
to build
kidding.
housing for people experiencing homelessness, which never should have happened. All of that is
Yes.
detailed in the 100-story home. But there was a moment of surrender when I realized, all right, God, like this was not really my idea. I was just going to do this one little piece. I was not going to launch a capital campaign. But I really want this to happen. It really matters to me that we get this done. And so I will show up if you will show off. Like, I don't know how we're going to get this done, but I recognize it is so much bigger than me and just put the people in my path. Help me show up every day, one foot after another, so that we can get this done. So I think there's a surrender to whispers that is maybe the biggest piece and an
Mm.
understanding it's not your idea, but you are willing to show up and be part of a collective whisper and a collective call to do good and to do something bigger.
Amen. Amen. So kind of looking forward, where are you going to take this from here? You got any more God dots planned or?
No, well, you can't plan God dots. That's the thing. That's why they're so amazing. Like I have no idea what's going to show up. But what I did realize is that in writing Trust the Whisper, I had these stories, and I had more stories. So I had to pick the ones that I felt like were undeniable, that to me were truly evidence of something bigger and divine going on. And I knew that when I published this book, and it's just been out, it just came out in June last month, I would start hearing from people going, oh my gosh, I know what you're talking about. Sally's done this amazing
uh,
thing. You should have written about Sally.
uh,
And so I've started a Substack called What's Your Whisper, where I write stories, the new ones that I hear of someone who's listened to a whisper in their life and what happened. And then I did a limited edition podcast called What's Your Whisper, where I told 8 stories and interviewed people on their stories, because I think it's powerful to hear in their own words not only what they heard, but why they listened and why they decided to do something about it. So that's on Apple and Spotify right now. You can hear those 8 episodes. So I think for me, that's what's next, to continue the writing, the speaking, the coaching, a ripple effect of encouraging people to do good, but also becoming a storyteller for other people's stories. So who knows, maybe there'll be I Trust the Whisper too with a whole nother collection of stories. I don't know. But at least on Substack, I can tell them immediately and just keep the encouragement going.
awesome. That's so wonderful. Well, Kathy, you're an amazing person. You've done amazing things. I mean, when I heard about this book coming out, I was thrilled because I knew all of that, and I knew that
Mhm.
you tell these stories well and pick the stories well. So thank you very much for doing that.
Well,
Um,
thank you. And like I said, I think the community that you've created and that you continue to create, I think is so important because being a solo entrepreneur, you start to think, what, am I crazy? Am I the only person who's trying to do this? And so the people I've met through your communities and your writing have been just really impactful. So I thank you, Brian, for listening to your whisper to do something I'm sure you weren't planning to start all this, but I think you've been really faithful in listening to your whispers and to trusting your gut to creating these conferences and these places to convene and find community.
well, thank you. Thank you very much. Again, check out this book. It's called Trust the Whisper, How Answering Quiet Callings Inspires Extraordinary Stories of Ordinary Grace. And go to Kathy's website, kathyizard.com. So Kathy, again, congratulations on everything and best wishes with this new book and all of your work.
Thanks so much, Brian.